Member for Castries South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I had expected to speak second in accordance with the order agreed to, but having been asked by my former parliamentary representative and in deference of former Prime Minister, I agree that I shall become a junior to him today. But Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to the Appropriations Bill 2019-2020 as presented by the Minister of Finance. As usual, it is a natural reaction to reject the philosophical approach which guides the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, I had intended when I originally made my notes to speak on some specific issues which falls under my purview as the Shadow Minister. Some of my colleagues have already said what I intended to say, so I will avoid too much repetition today. But Mr. Speaker, last night we listened to the member for Castries Southeast. And it gives me an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to comment on some of the things which he said. Mr. Speaker, you would note that he never referred to the budget presentation, not a page was referred to, not a quote was cited, not a reference was made, but that's his style, Mr. Speaker, and we take him for what and who he is. But on many occasions, Mr. Speaker, you reminded me of the court jester. In the old days, you had someone who presented and made everybody laugh and had all the antics and shouting and hopping. And Mr. Speaker, he entertained us last night. But in between, Mr. Speaker, he made some telling statements which must be responded to. But Mr. Speaker, in all his entertainment, his most telling statement, which will go down in history, is saying that 50% of St. Lucians are Chasnays. And that's why the UWPs won the last election. And I had to tease my friend, the member from Babono, and told him that even he is starting to look like a Chasnay now. Mr. Speaker, for the record, I don't have a problem with the Chasnays. His father, the father of the Prime Minister, Sir Michael, I used to see him very often, especially during Cricket World Cup, and he used to call me a comrade. Yes. You know, the Prime Minister's sister is a very pleasant lady, and during my tenure as the High Commissioner, she was always very supportive of the St. Lucian community in London. And of course, his father, Mrs. Chasnay, is quite a lovely lady. But to say that 50% of St. Lucians are Chasnays is throwing a piece a bit too far. But Mr. Speaker, I leave it for the other side to look in the mirror and to see the extent to which they are now starting to look like Chasnays. But Mr. Speaker, in the estimates debate, I refer to this government as a schizophrenic government. Mr. Speaker, they have a different sense of reality. And if I ever doubted it, Mr. Speaker, in the start of this debate on the appropriation bills, in statements of ministers, the Prime Minister stood up and he expressed sympathy with France and the people of France, and he looked at the burning of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Mr. Speaker. And those of us who've had the pleasure to see it and know about it, we recognize how historic it is. But Mr. Speaker, we had, and may I add, Mr. Speaker, the President Macron stood up and said, we will rebuild because of the historical significance of that cathedral. But the Folk Research Center burnt. And I was wondering if you have a sense of reality to appreciate the burning of the cathedral in Paris, how can you not appreciate the burning of the Folk Research Center? I'm sure the member from Castries North would say, I will rebuild the Folk Research Center, and not just because it may be in his constituency, but because of its significance. Mr. Speaker, I listened to the member from Castries Central, who's always critical of our relationship with certain events and our own relationship to God and to the church, Mr. Speaker. And she was saying, it is Holy Week. I didn't hear her chastise the government for having a debate during Holy Week, a week when we're supposed to be calm, reflective, and showing penance, Mr. Speaker. We did not even hear that, Mr. Speaker, and I will tone down today, Mr. Speaker, because it is Holy Week. But you know what she went on to say? After her presentation, she has to leave to go and meet her family to spend the rest of Holy Week with them. And we are left to do the debating in here, Mr. Speaker. Why couldn't we have debated next week? There's a schizophrenia, Mr. Speaker. They have one sense of reality, they do something different, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to start with the plea of the honorable member from Babono. And when he said it, Mr. Speaker, I felt it. He cried out to us not to allow politics to make us destroy each other, to destroy families and destroy reputations. And he was making a plea based on experiences. And they have members on the other side who've been through both experiences. And the more experienced ones are saying, let us not continue down that road. So, honorable member, I agree with you. I heard the member from Choiseul Saltibus, and I will say a few things to the honorable member later on, Mr. Speaker. Speak about the Labour Party sets out to slander people, winning at all costs to get into government. And I heard the member from Castries South East last night said, they came in after me, they come after me. And Labour Party goes after everybody who criticizes them. Mr. Speaker, I can talk about those experiences. I have never done anything to any member on the other side. I know there's one member who is still unhappy with me, Mr. Speaker, for a particular experience we have. But he knows my regard for him, and I'm sure he has some regard for me, Mr. Speaker. And he always reminds me every now and then of that, Mr. Speaker. But we laugh about it. And I've said to him it was wrong then. Because, Mr. Speaker, before I became a candidate, Mr. Speaker, even before I was announced as a candidate, Mr. Speaker, I was a targeted person. Mr. Speaker, I accepted that was just part of a political campaign. But it continued even after United Workers' Party had won. It went on and on and on. And I had to take legal action, Mr. Speaker. But it still did not stop, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it got worse. Worse, Mr. Speaker. It was claimed that I stole a vehicle belonging to the state. Every effort has been made to get customs and law enforcement agencies to seize my vehicle and arrest me. Ministers, Mr. Speaker, were involved in calling government departments, Mr. Speaker, to force public servants to take action against me, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was been said at United Workers' Party constituency group meetings that don't worry, Ernest Hilaire will soon be in jail, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? I'm beginning to believe there's something called karma. Tanto. One of those that was calling, Mr. Speaker. I look for him every day of this debate so far. Mr. Speaker, I had a bank transaction, Mr. Speaker, and somebody put on Facebook all my banking details. I know where they got it from, and I know who did it, Mr. Speaker. But I still laugh with that person, and I still shake their hand, Mr. Speaker, because I'm a bigger person. Mr. Speaker, a video was made of me and put on Facebook by United Park, distributed all over the world. Photos were taken of my vehicle outside Parliament, Mr. Speaker. Not even in Parliament, Mr. Speaker. One can be safe and sure, Mr. Speaker. And a video, Mr. Speaker, the voice of the person was identifiable. I didn't take action, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they photoshopped myself, Dr. Anthony, on a bed, Mr. Speaker. On a bed, it was on United Park, together, naked, Mr. Speaker. I smiled, Mr. Speaker. They photoshopped a document on United Park again, showing that I was paying Cambridge Analytica. Mr. Speaker, I smiled, Mr. Speaker, because we all know, based on the inquiry that took place in the House of Commons, who Cambridge Analytica had dealings with in St. Lucia. And Mr. Speaker, to crown it off, Mr. Speaker, Do you want me to go and get the document and quote it in this room, where it was said by Alexander Nix that he had dealings with a United Workers' Party government? Mr. Speaker, let's move on. Mr. Speaker, you know, to crown it off, a foreign government was asked to investigate me on behalf of the government of St. Lucia.
That is true.
A foreign government. And the Prime Minister sat here and he shouted to the leader of the opposition, how a certain agency is looking into me. Remember that member from Castries East?
That's true.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I can go on and on, Mr. Speaker. Members of my executive have been offered monies to take my meetings. They have had people that have been offered meetings to compromise me, offered money to compromise me. But I smile, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sometimes I despair for where our country is going. But there are times when I hear of public servants trying to do the right thing, police officers, senior members of the public service. I have faith once again, Mr. Speaker. So, I have faith, Mr. Speaker. I want the member for Castries to promise the people of St. Lucia that one of the first pieces of legislation that an SLP government will enact is to introduce heavy penalties for any person involved or directing the surveillance of citizens without court approval. Because there's every reason to believe that citizens have been spied on, electronic and otherwise, and information used for political purposes, Mr. Speaker. This is blatantly wrong and must be dealt with, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, they forget there is something called digital signatures. When you're listening, you're leaving signatures. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, let's not go there. Mr. Speaker, I have received death threats. I have received political threats and other forms of intimidation, Mr. Speaker. It is that bad, Mr. Speaker, that I've told my daughters that when they last see me, it might be the last time they will see me. I have told my team that every time I leave my home, I believe it's the last time I'm leaving my home. Mr. Speaker, but I'm not afraid. I am not afraid, Mr. Speaker. So, member from Babono, I agree with you. Let's not allow politics to make monsters of us. I have no ill feelings towards anyone. I love a good debate. I like to stand here and debate, Mr. Speaker. And you were right, honorable member, in saying us, because there are some evil people around you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't say next to you, I said around you, Mr. Speaker. That's what I said. But, Mr. Speaker, spare me a few minutes to respond to some of the claims of the member from Castries Southeast. Every debate, Mr. Speaker, the same thing. Same thing, découché. Pas même découché, trois couché, quatre couché. He takes Rick Wayne's books and quotes them, Mr. Speaker. He says his history of St. Lucia is based on Rick Wayne books, that he is influenced by Rick Wayne. And now he shared the books with a member from Ancillary Canaries, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, he claims that he's in the same intellectual mode as Rick Wayne. Mr. Speaker, some love Rick Wayne, some will hate him. But honorable members, none of you are in the same intellectual mode as Rick Wayne. His most famous quote from Rick Wayne, and he used it last night. He says, "He who is double-crossed, crosses." Mr. Speaker, he's a master at double-crossing. He was quoting Rick Wayne, who said that Gigi said that. Read properly. But, Mr. Speaker, he's a master at double-crossing. Ask the member from Castries North about his double-crossing. Ask Sir John about his double-crossing. And now, Mr. Speaker, ask the member from Ancillary Canaries. You know, I was in a bar on the border between Ancillary Canaries and Castries South. And somebody said to me, "Garçon, mangal oblige gagner." I said, "Gagner qui ça? Mangal pa ka monter?" He dit, "Oui, garçon, gars vle mangal monter pour Ancillary Canaries." And I felt the stab in my back, Mr. Speaker. I felt it. And not even a UWP, but I felt the stab in my back. Because CC is putting too much pressure. But, Mr. Speaker, let's move on, Mr. Speaker. So when he speaks about double-crossing, that's a master of double-crossing. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member is fond of speaking about St. Jude Hospital. Mr. Speaker, enough has been said in this honorable House about cost. Both sides will claim what was the true cost, what was spent, what was not spent. The people of St. Lucia are tired of that. Enough have been said about who said it would finish when. Both sides. I have transcripts of the Honorable Minister saying it will take 4 years to finish the project. I have of the Honorable Minister of Health saying it would finish by a certain date. Both sides have done it, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, let's finish that debate. There's one essential difference between this side and the government side. The Labour Party fund a project with no plans, no funding. The member for Castries North, in all his true intent, was trying desperately to solve that situation. He lost power. The Labour Party came in. The member for Vieux-Fort South decided to expand the footprint, to do something bigger. And then he had to face the reality of going and find money to finish it off. The same challenge the government side is facing. But nobody on this side wrote a Padua letter. Nobody did. But, Mr. Speaker, there was one difference. The Labour Party, with all the challenges, never stopped working to try to finish St. Jude. The member for Castries North never stopped working. So even on the government side, under a previous life, they never stopped working. But this government has stopped working. That is the fundamental difference. And for me, Mr. Speaker, I have one argument to make. If you believe that you truly care about the welfare of the people, you should never have stopped working. You should have expedited the works. That, for me, is the essential difference. Not who spent what, who did not spend what. Not who said what date, who did not say one date. It's about an intent to meet the needs, the health needs of the people of St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, I beg of you to go to the children's ward at VH. Walk through VH, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is a crying shame what our health situation has worsened to. If it was bad under the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, it's tenfold worse under this government. And it's because they have shown no urgency to address it, Mr. Speaker. No urgency. That's the point, Mr. Speaker. Not who spent what, not who gave what dates, but who showed that deep caring for the people of St. Lucia, that it would solve the healthcare crisis. And you said you would have done it. And nothing else matters to me, Mr. Speaker. My side could have been wrong in giving figures. My side could have been wrong in giving finishing dates. But my side was never wrong in trying every single day to finish that hospital, Mr. Speaker. And that is the failing on this side, Mr. Speaker. I heard a member of Castries say, the challenge for government is implementation. And the member for Soufrière, when he first presented in this house, he repeated the words of the member from Castries South is, execute, execute, execute. And I shouted to him, those words will haunt you, Mr. Speaker. Because those of us who I've never been in government as a minister, but I've been involved in project management, Mr. Speaker. Building the National Stadium, building the Bosejo Cricket Ground, Cricket World Cup, World T20. I have worked, Mr. Speaker, and I know the realities of execution. And I told him those words would haunt him, Mr. Speaker. 3 years later, he cannot open the Soufrière Square, Mr. Speaker. What is he executing? Yeah. But, Mr. Speaker, the same minister from Castries South East, his ministry has one of the worst records of implementation.
That's true.
Mr. Speaker, the grants for this country is declining rapidly. Check the estimates. The public sector investment program, PSIP, from his ministry, Mr. Speaker, is virtually non-existent. Non-existent, Mr. Speaker. And I hear now he's firing his entire project management staff. He's replacing the head of the unit. He's bringing in a new person, a new deputy. He's firing that one because he's claiming it's the public servants that are not implementing the projects, and the problem is not him. Mr. Speaker, you know, I have friends that work for international institutions, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, there are projects in this country that we are about to lose the funding for because of poor implementation by this government, Mr. Speaker. World Bank projects, Mr. Speaker. And you know, the member from Grizzly was honest enough to stand in this house and say there's a problem with BNTF and implementation. He's going to work hard at redressing it. Because that's the reality, Mr. Speaker. But this government is worse than any other government has been, Mr. Speaker. And then, Mr. Speaker, in project implementation, and if I had the time, I would cite projects for you, Mr. Speaker. I would cite them. But let's move on. The member from Castries office says he knows how money does operate. Of course he knows how money does operate, Mr. Speaker. It operates for him, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in public, on a public television, a talk show host showed a payment to an individual supervising CDP projects. But it was claimed that he's an employee in the Department of Infrastructure. It was claimed. I have heard no rebuttal from the Department of Infrastructure to say that person is not an employee. I have heard nothing from the member of Castries office to say that person is not a supervisor for CDP projects. So yes, Mr. Speaker, the member from Castries office knows how money operates, Mr. Speaker. He knows how it operates. Mr. Speaker, I have seen an invoice payment to a district education officer for a payment of $40,000 for a CDP project, Mr. Speaker.
That's true.
He knows, Mr. Speaker, how money does operate, Mr. Speaker. And then, Mr. Speaker, the member from Castries office says that his wife was attacked. Now, Mr. Speaker, I do not support attacking anybody's wife. Anybody's wife. And I will tell you, the member from Castries office, I've met his wife on a couple of occasions, and she's a lovely lady. I will not attack her. Mr. Speaker, I will attack nobody's wife in here. Nobody's wife in here. Even the Prime Minister's wife, I think she's a fantastic person, Mr. Speaker. You should be proud to have somebody like her to be his wife, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member from Castries North, his wife grew up in the same area as me. She was always the most beautiful person on the block and a very nice person, Mr. Speaker. You should be proud to have her as a wife. I will never attack nobody's wife, Mr. Speaker. I will never attack nobody's wife. But, Mr. Speaker, when you, Mr. Speaker, enter the public domain, Mr. Speaker, you must accept that you will be scrutinized. You must accept that. So when the member made all the statements he did with all the bravado, I will build 10 schools for my wife. Don't you believe people will scrutinize you? And that she will become the subject of persons' comments, Mr. Speaker? When there are check handing over ceremonies to your wife, Mr. Speaker, or company she's associated with, whichever, Mr. Speaker, don't you expect there to be scrutiny of her, Mr. Speaker? You are taunting solutions that you will build more schools for your wife. Don't you expect that, Mr. Speaker?
He's the one who said it.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not saying she received any $10 million, but that does not solve the problem. You cannot do what you did and do not expect your wife to be subject to scrutiny, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member from South Office keeps talking about Uranura International Airport, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know my problem with this project, Mr. Speaker? I am not technically competent to speak about location of terminal and runway. I know my boundaries, Mr. Speaker. I know my boundaries. I leave that for the more competent persons, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, St. Lucians will not accept that this is a huge amount of borrowing which we did not have to do. We had a PPP where we would not be borrowing the money. And, Mr. Speaker, we are asked to meet a bill of about $400 million, Mr. Speaker. That is what is pricking St. Lucians, Mr. Speaker. And you know what is stabbing them? There was no tendering, Mr. Speaker. No tendering for the contractor. The largest infrastructural project in the history of St. Lucia. And there was no tendering, Mr. Speaker. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, we came to this house. We were told the drawings have not been finished yet. The architects will be appointed and the drawings will be finished later. But we already had a costing. It's like you building a house, you haven't finished draw the house yet and do the plans, but you have a costing for it already. And you already have a contractor to build it. Mr. Speaker, that cannot be right, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will return to the member from Castries office a little later on. Let us return to the substance of the budget, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, listening to the government side, there were two themes. Two themes. That they were better managers of the economy, and that they based on the figures, and then that this budget is a people's budget. Two themes. They are better managers of the economy based on figures, and that this budget is a people's budget. They are trying to argue, Mr. Speaker, that they are better managers than the opposition. 3 years after winning the elections, you are still in election mode, wanting to prove to the people of St. Lucia that you are better managers. 3 years after you won the elections, and you're still trying to convince people that you are the better manager. Mr. Speaker, but listen to this, and that's where this debate starts getting a little interesting. All what I have said, Mr. Speaker, is not the substance of my presentation. In support of the argument that the government were better managers, you would have heard members on the other side boast of growth, improved fiscal operations, unparalleled increases in tourist arrival, and an unprecedented decrease in unemployment. But, Mr. Speaker, these boasts require an examination of the figures. So today, Mr. Speaker, I want to deal with facts and figures, because that's what they were presented. There'll be no Jerry Springer entertainment like we saw last night, Mr. Speaker. Right. No Jerry Springer.
Nothing about not being at OAS.
Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister finished his budget presentation, do you know how I felt? I remember when I was a young boy, and I'm sure the members there can share that. Remember the Cracker Jacks box? Cracker Jacks. There's something called Cracker Jacks, Mr. Speaker. And we all wanted a Cracker Jacks box. Because inside the Cracker Jacks box, Mr. Speaker, you had molasses-flavored, caramel-coated popcorn. And there was always a little toy inside of it. The member from Castries North nods his head. I'm sure the member from Grosley remember Cracker Jack boxes. We all wanted a Cracker Jacks box, Mr. Speaker, because we always hoped that after all the sweetness of the popcorn, and when we dug deep inside, we would get a prize that was valuable. But it was never valuable, Mr. Speaker. The prize was always some little plastic something. This presentation by the Minister of Finance was full of sweet words, long do, enough glitz and glamour, teleprompter, and plenty of snake oil salesmanship, Mr. Speaker. And as usual, Mr. Speaker, when you dig deep inside its contents, there is nothing of value, like a Cracker Jack box, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's look at the improvement in fiscal operations of this government. I've already expressed during the estimates debate that the figures don't really add up. They don't. The Prime Minister assured us as Minister of Finance that all the figures are correct. And he asked us to meet with the Ministry of Finance to clarify if we want. I will take the opportunity to sit with the Ministry of Finance to explain to me the calculations, because it's important, Mr. Speaker, as the opposition, that we understand the computation of the figures. But, Mr. Speaker, I heard it last night from the member from Castries office, and the member from Soufrière, and even the member from Strozel, debt to GDP ratio. And I want to say something about it. Do not beat your chest about debt to GDP ratio, because there is something called rebasing. And let me explain to the members, and I promised the member, and he's not here now, I'll explain to him what rebasing is about. The Prime Minister challenged me last night to explain rebasing, so let me explain rebasing now. Mr. Speaker, there's a basket of goods and services that are valued in an economy, and that determines your GDP. So let's assume, Mr. Speaker, in 2010, let's just assume we had a quarry. That quarry produced a very insignificant amount of products. But over the years, it started to export. And as it exported, the value increased substantially. In about 10 years, when they are reconfiguring the baskets of goods or services, they will now add quarry in, because it now adds to the GDP, to the basket. It's now significant. So the value you had in 2010 did not have quarry value. But in 2020 or 2015, it will now have the quarry value. So the size of the basket, the value of the basket is now bigger, because you've added the value of quarry that was not there in 2010. That's called rebasing. You are rebasing the economy. You add in new goods and services that were not there before. So the size of your GDP increases because you've added new goods and services into it. Some may have been insignificant. So if in 2010 we were not exporting aluminum windows and doors, but 5 years later, that's a significant part of our export, our GDP will increase when the rebasing is done. It wasn't there in 2010, but when the new basket is done, it is added in. Now, that increase, Mr. Speaker, in the value, if that increase in value is greater than the increase in the loans you are taking, your GDP to debt, your debt to GDP ratio must fall. If the increase in your GDP is the same as the increase in your debt borrowing, it will stay the same. You following me, Mr. Speaker? If the increase in the GDP is smaller than the increase in your loans, your debt to GDP will increase. In our case, our growth in the GDP due to rebasing is bigger than we had an increase in our loans. So there must be an improvement in debt to GDP, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'm not saying there was no growth. I'm not saying there was no growth. But the significant drop in debt to GDP ratio was due to rebasing, Mr. Speaker. So when the member from Strozel, debt to GDP, he never says rebasing is the main reason why it has improved. The member from Cassius office never said that. Never said it, Mr. Speaker. So let's be honest with the figures. If you are saying you are a better manager because of the figures, express the figures correctly.
The rebasing is not just after 1 year.
But you don't rebase after 1 year. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the member from Answer Carries you don't rebase after 1 year, Mr. Speaker. But let's move on. Let's move on. The second lesson. The second lesson. Mr. Speaker, let's look at growth. Let's look at growth. Mr. Speaker, was growth as spectacular? Was growth as spectacular as stated? Is there a point of order, Mr. Speaker? Oh, I should continue. You see, it's all relative. Of course it's all relative. But it's proportionate, Mr. Speaker. But anyway, I've made my point. I've made my point. Let's look at growth, Mr. Speaker. Was it as spectacular as stated? Members in here, Mr. Speaker, were jumping for joy and beating the desk. There was growth, we are better managers. But Mr. Speaker, listen to this. Listen to how ironic this is, Mr. Speaker. You had growth last year of about 3.5 or 3.3%. This year you have growth of 1.5, and you're saying how great you are. Now, let's not debate that. There was growth. But you grew 3.3% last year. This year you grew less than you grew last year. But you are celebrating. That shows I'm a great manager. Mr. Speaker, think about it. St. Lucians, think about it. You grew less this year, but you are boasting. That's a sign that you are a better manager. But Mr. Speaker, imagine that. Now, Mr. Speaker,
Honorable members,
you can argue during the tenure of the Labour Party there was smaller numbers growth and even negative. But I'll come to that. I'll come to that, Mr. Speaker. Remember that point, because I'll come to it, Mr. Speaker. No, don't worry, Mr. Speaker. Let me continue, Mr. Speaker. So, we boasting how great we are. Mr. Speaker, compare us to our neighbors. Compare us to our neighbors. The average growth for the Eastern Caribbean was over 3%. Over 3%, Mr. Speaker. So they're boasting they are better managers, although they had less growth than last year. But we are also doing worse than all the other islands around us. The only island we did better than was Dominica. And Dominica was devastated by a hurricane the year before. Mr. Speaker, there was growth. But we are underperforming, Mr. Speaker. With all the borrowing, with all the CIP money, Mr. Speaker, we are performing worse than we are supposed to be performing. We are borrowing large amounts of money, but we are underperforming. So the question, Mr. Speaker, is where is the money going? That's the question. Where is the money going? Mr. Speaker, and you know what is even most illogical, Mr. Speaker? Hey members on the other side, Mr. Speaker, I support this budget because we did well in the last budget. Let's go over that again. And the member from Ancillary was shouting it. I'm supporting this budget because of better fiscal operations in the last budget. But look at the figures for this budget, Mr. Speaker. The fiscal operations will be devastated. The figures are terrible, Mr. Speaker. Terrible. Are you supporting the budget because of how well you did last year? Or are you supporting the budget for how well the proposed budget will do? Listen to the figures according to the estimates, Mr. Speaker. Current surplus, Mr. Speaker. Look at, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to go through all of them. Just overall surplus, Mr. Speaker, will move from this year, negative 68 million to negative 189 million next year. Overall surplus, Mr. Speaker. This year, you're expecting to have negative 64 million. This budget that is supporting because of how well they did last year will have an overall deficit of $189 million. But you're supporting it because of how well you did in last year's budget. Mr. Speaker, let's look at unemployment, Mr. Speaker. Members opposite were boasting that they had reduced unemployment and there was so much for solutions to be cheerful about. Mr. Speaker, I want you to, Mr. Speaker, and I have some figures here that I want you to look at, Mr. Speaker. I want to share something with you, Mr. Speaker. Social and Economic Review 2014, and I have copies for all members. It's a documented house, 2014. 2014. Because I want to go back, Mr. Speaker, from 2006, Mr. Speaker. I want to go back, Mr. Speaker, and I have copies for all members, Mr. Speaker. I have copies for all members. Such. Not to run out of the chamber. I'm coming to you. Stay there. Not to run, Mr. Speaker. Not to run. Mr. Speaker, let me give you the figures. And I want the member from Castries North to follow me on this one because he better than anybody can explain that experience. In 2005, Mr. Speaker, unemployment was 18.7%. When Labour Party came into power, it was high. And it was brought down 18.7. 2006, it was 16.7. Then Honourable Member from Castries North came into power. Cricket World Cup in 2007. Unemployment dropped to 14%. 14%. Mr. Speaker, by 2008, the year after, it increased to 15.7%, Mr. Speaker. By 2009, unemployment went to 18.1. By 2010, it was 20.6. By 2011, when he lost, it was 21.2. It increased every single year. But note, Mr. Speaker, note, importantly, for every year there was growth, or almost every year the member from Castries North got growth. So he was getting growth, but unemployment was still increasing. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, look at the employed labor force. For the same years from 2006 to 2011, the member from Castries North created more jobs every single year. You know what this figure tells us, Mr. Speaker? For every year, the member for Castries North was getting growth, he was creating more jobs, but unemployment was still going up. That's what the figures tell us. That's what the figures tell us, Mr. Speaker. Let me repeat it. When the member from Castries North took over from the Labour Party, unemployment was 14%. By the time he left in 2011, it was 21.7%. 21.2. Yet he had growth every single year, Mr. Speaker. So how he has growth every year, he's creating jobs every year, and unemployment is still going up, Mr. Speaker. And yet they beat their chest about unemployment. Unemployment, we deep in it. You deep in it? Let me take you, Mr. Speaker, to the Social and Economic Review for this year. And look at page 110 for me, Mr. Speaker. Look at page 110. Social and Economic Review for this year. And Mr. Speaker, they have a habit when you start to give them the figures, everybody disappears from the chamber, Mr. Speaker. But I noticed that you're still there, Mr. Speaker. So let's look at page 110, Mr. Speaker. And I want you, Mr. Speaker, and all the members on the other side who are talking figures, figures, figures with better managers, open your books on page 110 and let's look at the figures. And let's go on this journey with me. Since 2008, Mr. Speaker, the working age population increased every single year from 2008. But from 2016, all of a sudden, the working age population started to decline. It started to decline, Mr. Speaker. Look at it, Mr. Speaker. The working age population from 2008, it increased every single year. But when we reached 2016, the working age population started to decline. Why, Mr. Speaker? Why, Mr. Speaker? I am not providing the answers today, Mr. Speaker. But remember, it's increasing every year. But 2016, the government changes, and it starts to decline, Mr. Speaker. Since 2008, Mr. Speaker, the labor force increased every year. Until when? 2016. It starts to decline, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, the more important figure, the employed labor force from 2008 and 2016, it increased, Mr. Speaker. From 2008 until 2016, then it started to decline. Look at the figures, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, look at how telling those figures are. Listen to this one. In 2016, there were 82,379 people working in St. Lucia. In 2016, 82,379 people working in St. Lucia. In 2018, we had 81,417 people working in St. Lucia. We had less people working in 2018 than we had in 2016. Let me say it again. Let me say it again. In 2016, we had 82,379 people working. In 2018, it dropped to 81,417. We have less people working in 2018 than we had working in 2016 when the UWP came into power. But everybody beating their chest, we created more jobs. Mr. Speaker, if you're creating more jobs, why is it less people working in St. Lucia? And I'm not, I took it from the figures. I'm not beating my chest. I'm not making money work for me. I'm just quoting the figures, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, you both, you see, again, the member says it's unemployment figures that matters. What matters, Mr. Speaker, is whether you're creating more jobs or not. There are less people working now than in 2016. So employed people are leaving St. Lucia to go and work elsewhere. Well, maybe that's true. But why are people who can find jobs in St. Lucia leaving St. Lucia to go elsewhere, but people that do have jobs in St. Lucia are not good and find those jobs themselves? Maybe there's some story in there, Mr. Speaker. But let's leave that aside for now, Mr. Speaker. Then, Mr. Speaker, the figures again. Improvement in CIP figures. The CIP has been decimated and destroyed by this government. Mr. Speaker, whilst we hear in other countries, CIP money is being used for housing, for healthcare, for roads, for education. St. Lucians cannot say where their CIP monies are going. Maybe it's going in horses, Mr. Speaker. The PM refuses to come to Parliament, Mr. Speaker, with a statement as required by law, stating how much is to be collected and the use of the monies and to get parliamentary approval. The increase this year, Mr. Speaker, of $60 million is due to range development, bringing in applications to finance the construction of its hotel, proposed hotel in Black Bay. We all know that ended in disaster, and range had to be given an out-of-court settlement, Mr. Speaker. And whether it is $43 million, as stated by the member from Ancillary, or 20-something million dollars, Mr. Speaker, the government of St. Lucia had to pay an investor who was bringing money into St. Lucia for a hotel project a payout settlement. Imagine an investor is coming to your country. He's brought in $54 million from your CIP. And then you mess up the project so badly, you have to settle him out of court, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I must ask the member from Shrewsbury Saltibus, where is the joint statement? Where is it? And he is the minister responsible for investment, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the note of investment, Mr. Speaker, I want to read from last year's budget, Mr. Speaker, page 17. Page 17 from last year's budget, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member, you have 15 minutes in which to complete your presentation.
15 minutes?
Yes.
Yeah. 45 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I stand to invoke Standing Order 3210 to allow the member another 60 minutes, 1 hour to complete his presentation.
Honorable members,
I'll try and rush it.
the question is that standing order 4210 be invoked to grant the member for Cash Reserve an additional hour. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
As many as of contrary opinion, say no.
No.
I think the noes have it. The noes have it.
Speaker.
Honorable member for Swazan, Saltibus.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to invoke Section 3210 to give the member for Cash South an additional 30 minutes.
Honorable members, the question is that standing order 4210 be invoked to grant the member for Cash Reserve an additional 40 minutes in which to complete his presentation. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, this is not the spirit of the House. We had agreed everybody would get 1 hour. We've given extensions to the member from Meekwood North, Strozel Saltibus, Castries Southeast.
That's okay.
But Mr. Speaker, that's okay.
That's okay, comrade.
That's okay, Mr. Speaker.
That's okay, comrade.
Mr. Speaker,
Comrade.
Mr. Speaker, I will not relent, Mr. Speaker. I will not relent.
That's okay.
Mr. Speaker, I'll move on. Mr. Speaker, I won't even read from any address last year, Mr. Speaker.
That's okay.
The Prime Minister boasted
Okay.
7 hotels will be built, Mr. Speaker.
That's okay.
7. How many were built, Mr. Speaker? How many were built? And you know what we're hearing this year, Mr. Speaker? You know what we're hearing this year? That there will be the same 7 hotels will be built. But worse, Mr. Speaker, DSH will now have 2 hotels on property. 2 hotels additionally will be built at the racetrack, Mr. Speaker. And who you fooling, Mr. Speaker? Who you fooling, Mr. Speaker? Who you fooling? Every year you're going to build 7 hotels. The Prime Minister asked for 3 years to deliver on all the projects. And after 3 years, not 1 hotel, not 1 project, Mr. Speaker. He told Rick Wayne on his program that by January 2018, over $2 billion would be injected into this economy. Where is it, Mr. Speaker? And let me speak on tourism now, Mr. Speaker. Tourism, because I have a lot to say about tourism, although in 30 minutes, Mr. Speaker. The minister speaks, Mr. Speaker, of record years. This 2018 was a record year. Mr. Speaker, can I tell you something, Mr. Speaker? Go and look at page 7 of the Social and Economic Review, Mr. Speaker. Page 93, Mr. Speaker. 93. The year 2014 was a record year. 2015 was a record year. 2017 was a record year. 2018 was a record year. Every year you got more than the last year is a record year. Every year is a record year. We have been having record years for many years. Once you have growth and you surpass last year, you have a record year.
Simple as that.
Simple, Mr. Speaker. I heard the minister boast, we got leading honeymoon destination, as if that's the first time St. Lucia has ever gotten an award. We've been getting awards in tourism before I was born, Mr. Speaker. But that's what he's boasting of, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, the records show that overall tourism arrivals increased by 10.2%, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, that was largely due to increases in cruise ship visitors and yacht arrivals. Stay-over tourism, Mr. Speaker, increased by 2.2%. 2.2%. The value of tourism, Mr. Speaker, is largely in stay-over tourists. Not cruise ships, not yachts. They all contribute. But largely, Mr. Speaker, stay-over tourism, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want you to look at some statistics, Mr. Speaker. Look at some statistics, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you would see, Mr. Speaker, that between April to December in 2018, less people came to St. Lucia, stay over, than April to December 2017. Let me put it slowly for you, Minister. After April last year, and the reason why we had such an increase in stay-over tourism is because of a very large March 2018. Look at the statistics. March 2018.
What's the point?
That's the point coming.
What's the point?
From April to December in 2018, stay-over tourists declined over April to December 2017. That means we had one good month, which was March. So in 2017, between April and December, we had 649 stay-over tourists, Mr. Speaker. In 2018, it declined, Mr. Speaker. It declined. It means from April 2017, our stay-over tourist arrival has been declining, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, here is where I really want to speak to the Minister, Mr. Speaker. And that's why I really want to speak to him. Mr. Speaker, Soleil Festival, Mr. Speaker. Soleil. Here the Prime Minister, when they launched Soleil, 2nd February 2017 at the Big Gardens Hotel. The idea is when you come to St. Lucia, you can stay all summer long with the extensive events calendar and no shortage of amazing places and sites to visit. Mr. Speaker, let's look at tourist arrival during Soleil festivals, Mr. Speaker. The first one, January 2018, peak time for arrivals, a 3.5% increase in tourist arrivals. St. Lucia Jazz Festival 2018, major festival. 841 more persons came to St. Lucia. 841 more persons, Mr. Speaker, about a 2.5% increase. St. Lucia Carnival, July 2018, a decline in visitor arrival. Listen to this. A government had said they spent $12 million on Carnival last year. Less people came during Carnival last year than in 2017. The Roots and Soul Festival, December 2018, a decline of 6.5%, Mr. Speaker. Another Soleil Festival. The Arts and Heritage Festival in October 2018, a decline of 7.1%, Mr. Speaker. 4 of the festivals, Mr. Speaker.
Soleil.
4 of them. At least, Mr. Speaker, 3 of them, we had 4 new festivals. 3 of them, we had declining arrivals. But he's beating his chest that he's doing such a wonderful job, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister explain to us why the Soleil festivals last year registered declines in visitor arrivals and not increases? And you notice, Mr. Speaker, this year, you parlé about Soleil Kaisala. There was no mention of Soleil, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister did not mention it. Soleil la couché pour vous. The Minister did not mention it. What has happened to Soleil, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I made the point before, Mr. Speaker, that less cruise ships are coming to St. Lucia. But I concede bigger ships are coming, Mr. Speaker. And because bigger ships are coming, more people are arriving. It's mathematical. The member, the minister, is arguing with me why I want more ships to come to St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, if more of bigger comes, we are much better off. Think about it. If the ships are getting bigger and we can keep the same number of ships, we're even better for it, Mr. Speaker. So he's saying to me, if I want 50 canoes to come to St. Lucia instead of one big cruise ship. But Mr. Speaker, you know, I want to...
Mr. Speaker, I raise in a point of order. The honourable member is misleading the House. Mr. Speaker, I did say that the measurement and the most important measurement that is made is not on the amount of ships, Mr. Speaker, as being said by the member of Castries South at a press conference. But what is most important, the most important measurement, Mr. Speaker, is the amount of cruise arrivals rather than cruise calls. So I want to make that point distinctly, that the member, in criticizing the administration because there was a reduction in cruise calls, we're saying to him that there is no need for as many calls because the measurement is arrival numbers. So you can have, Mr. Speaker, 100 calls, but you can have less people coming with more ships. That is the point. So the point is, what we want to make sure, Mr. Speaker, is that we have at least growth in the amount of people that arrive and not the amount of ships that arrive. That's the most important number because that's where the economic impact will come from.
Mr. Speaker, the point remains. Less ships are coming to St. Lucia. Less ships. Look at the statistics from the other islands. They're all getting more ships. And they're getting more of the bigger ships. So we're getting less of the bigger ships. But let's move on. Someday you will explain.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, Mr. Speaker, that is not correct.
What's the point of order now?
Mr. Speaker, he's misleading the House in that the other islands are not getting more ships.
Okay, they're not getting more ships. Let's move on.
Honorable.
Mr. Speaker, let's
I cannot verify.
Let me continue.
Prove it or withdraw the statement.
Okay, I withdraw it, Mr. Speaker. Let's go on. Mr. Speaker, you know, the member from Labrie once said that you really should... Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I want to comment, Mr. Speaker, on the proposed tax regime to come into effect on January the 1st, 2020. Mr. Speaker, the member for Vieux Fort South and the member for Castries North were both ministers of finance, and on successive occasions, they reduced the personal, they increased the personal allowance to allow thousands of lower earning workers to not pay any personal income tax. Both the member for Castries North and the member for Vieux Fort South will always be remembered for introducing changes that the lower income earning workers would not have to pay tax. On each instance, Mr. Speaker, there's a decline in tax revenue. But they accepted that that was a price to pay to empower those at the lower income earning brackets. As we heard, Mr. Speaker, this new proposal presented by the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance was not really new after all. The member for Vieux Fort South had presented a similar proposal in 2015. And from what the member from Vieux Fort South told us last night, it was a better proposal. Mr. Speaker, I had a difficulty in 2015 when the member from Vieux Fort South presented that proposal. I had a little difficulty with it, Mr. Speaker. But I'm opposed to what's been presented to this House, Mr. Speaker. And let me explain why. Personally, I think that the tax base should be widened to ensure that when citizens benefit from government programs, they must also accept some responsibility for paying for it. I also accept, Mr. Speaker, that the lower income earners must be given exceptions or exemptions, and even in some instances allow them not to pay taxes, Mr. Speaker. I expect medium income earners to pay more tax and the higher income earners to pay even more. But I believe this spread, Mr. Speaker, must be done evenly, fairly, and with some equity, Mr. Speaker. There must be, Mr. Speaker, some level of equity. It is why, Mr. Speaker, I supported a VAT or a sales tax regime, Mr. Speaker, because it is based on consumption and on personal choices. In effect, you know what a VAT says, Mr. Speaker? I'm giving you a tax break by reducing your personal income tax. You have more disposable income, spend it wisely. But if you're going to spend it on Nikes and stereos and more cars, then you have to pay for it. So as you make your personal choices on consumption, you pay more for the taxes, Mr. Speaker. So the VAT has a broad application, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, based on what the Prime Minister presented, I support the relief to the lower income earners, Mr. Speaker. Those between 18,000 and 23,000, Mr. Speaker. I support it, Mr. Speaker. They will not pay any more taxes. But on page 45, the Prime Minister says that this is going to be revenue neutral. Although the estimates on page 17, Mr. Speaker, shows that there will be an increase in personal tax collection. So he told us it's going to be neutral, but yet there's going to be an increase in the estimates in personal tax. But maybe that's natural growth, yeah, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I cannot accept that the middle and higher income earners are the ones being asked to pay more taxes in this instance. I repeat, Mr. Speaker, in this instance, I cannot accept that the middle income and higher income earners must be made to pay. The Prime Minister has destroyed the working people, Mr. Speaker. Now he wants to buy them back for 10 pieces of silver, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this will hurt our middle managers and our high-income earners, the doctors, the lawyers, the accountants, the engineers, the managers. It will hurt them, and I'll explain to you, Mr. Speaker. They are asked to pay for the shortfall, Mr. Speaker. Persons in the public service from about grade 14, Mr. Speaker, this will severely affect them, Mr. Speaker. I expect CSC and SLTU and Principals Association to do the analysis, Mr. Speaker. But just imagine, Mr. Speaker, if you're an accountant 2 in the public service, an accountant 2, Mr. Speaker, you didn't have a house before, your allowances were very low, Mr. Speaker. This will benefit you. But the day you decide now to buy a house for $500,000 and you have a child, that's where it bites you, Mr. Speaker, because you will now have mortgage interest payments, house insurance, property tax, house maintenance. You'll have credit union savings for your child to go to school. You will have medical insurance. All of that will push your allowances up to $45,000. So whereas as a young person just enter in the public service, the changes will benefit you. You will pay less tax. But the day you decide to buy a house, you will wish the old order was in place, because you will pay more taxes than you would under the present system. You will pay more taxes. And there'll be a more detailed analysis, and we'll have a press conference where we discuss all of that. Mr. Speaker, this is going to discourage the young lawyers and doctors and engineers and accountants, the senior public servants, Mr. Speaker, the managers, Mr. Speaker. This is going to discourage them, because the moment your allowances start increasing, this is going to bite you, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, you know why I'm really against this, Mr. Speaker? Let me tell you why I'm really against it. Mr. Speaker, and I want it recorded strongly, Mr. Speaker, I think it is very unfair, Mr. Speaker, when taxes for those at the higher end is being increased, but on the other hand, we come into the same house and enact a headquarters agreement where foreign persons who come in here to work are exempted from paying any income tax. Let me repeat it. Under the headquarters agreement, the staff that are here are exempted from paying any personal tax, Mr. Speaker.
A point of order. Mr. Speaker, I certainly hope that the member from Castries South, who is correct in his assessment, will continue and also see that St. Lucians who are working in the headquarters also themselves don't have to pay income tax.
I'm coming to that.
Oh, I'm glad to hear
I'm
that.
coming to that, Mr. Speaker. That's part of it, Mr. Speaker. So listen to what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker. The member from Castries South who was a banker. He was a banker, and he had a significant income, Mr. Speaker. Say he was going to be asked, or anybody who is a banker, manager, and accountant, they will be asked to pay for the shortfall, Mr. Speaker. But there are companies that come here, set up as headquarters, and their staff that earning the same salary as St. Lucians are being told they do not pay income tax under the headquarters agreement. And you know what's going to happen, Mr. Speaker? There are certain companies in St. Lucia that will set up holding companies, register under the headquarters agreement, and they will start not paying income tax because they are registered under the headquarters agreement. How they cannot do it? I can tell you one local company that is registered under the headquarters agreement. We'll leave that for outside the house. I don't like calling out other people's business like that. Mr. Speaker, foreign high-income earners in St. Lucia working under the headquarters agreement paying no income tax. But St. Lucians who are high-income earners will be made to pay more income tax. I am against this proposal, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister should accept the shortfall in revenue, or the Prime Minister should amend the headquarters agreement to make those foreign high-income earners pay tax too, and not cause our local middle and high-income tax earners to pay more tax, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how many more minutes have Mr. Speaker? 20? Mr. Speaker.
20.
Mr. Speaker, the government would want us to believe that there is much improvement in our lives since 2016. That he's building St. Lucia and that we are all in. Mr. Speaker, any Form 5 student will tell you there's a difference between growth and development. Development is about improving the quality of lives of people. Growth is a statistical figure of how you can have growth, high numbers of growth, Mr. Speaker, and have no development. You can have high numbers of growth and have no development, because where the money going? Where the money going? So, Mr. Speaker, listen to the Prime Minister on page 3, on page 4, on page 5, on page 9. He's trying so hard to tell us that this is a budget for the people, a budget for the people, Mr. Speaker. But where are the policy and programs, Mr. Speaker, that can make St. Lucians believe those words, Mr. Speaker? Please tell me. Where are the estimates to achieve those sweet promises, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, this government is not about the people. It never was and it never will be, Mr. Speaker. This is a government which is ideologically driven by the belief that friends, family, and undeserving foreigners come first. And I just showed it with the personal income tax, Mr. Speaker. Listen to the Prime Minister on page 44 of the budget statement, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a government that is institutionalizing financial mismanagement and normalizing irregular financial practices. And some may say, Mr. Speaker, that this government is creating a culture of corruption. This is happening at all levels, Mr. Speaker, from ministers to operatives at the constituency level, from party leaders to political office bearers. There's a spreading greed, Mr. Speaker, that is frightening. The state is now seen as an instrument of enrichment and self-aggrandizement, Mr. Speaker. So yes, there is growth, Mr. Speaker, but who is benefiting? So there's investment in roads, in bridges, in walkways, in pathways, in retaining walls, but who is benefiting, Mr. Speaker? So millions have been spent on airport development, but who is benefiting, Mr. Speaker? Tell me who is. Mr. Speaker, no matter how much growth, how much better managers they are, if you are not in the interest of the people, it will mean nothing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the PM said last year that accountability and transparency are the priorities of his government. And yesterday, the member from Library quoted, Mr. Speaker, his exact words on corruption, Mr. Speaker. And then he challenged a member, where did he get it from? I got it on his Facebook page, Mr. Speaker. Deny that it's on the Facebook page, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, when I read the Prime Minister's words, I said to myself, I can understand why, Mr. Speaker, there have never been an address to this nation on the circumstances which led to a government minister, Jimmy Henry, being fired. Our Prime Minister has never addressed the nation on the circumstances under which, he resigned when he was asked to resign. And don't let me put your business out in the public, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, but no, okay, he was asked, he resigned. But tell us why he resigned. Don't you have an obligation to the country to say that there is a minister, there are a lot of speculations about him, and then things are cloudy, Mr. Speaker, and you don't think you have an obligation to address the nation and explain why you find a minister of the crown, Mr. Speaker? I can understand why, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's response to the first Ubaldo Raymond matter, Mr. Speaker, was to see what the court decision would be.
Honorable member. Now you violated
Senator Raymond?
You violated.
My apologies. I thought he had resigned, Mr. Speaker. My apologies. I thought he had resigned. I read that somewhere. Mr. Speaker, I can understand why, Mr. Speaker, there have been no reports on that investigation into the Ascenza papers which were published in the US in relation to the previous airport development project. The Prime Minister told us that he was investigating the reports about a minister of his government, a member from Castle Southeast. Where is the report? Where is it, Mr. Speaker? And why, Mr. Speaker, there's no action against the same minister for providing a letter to friends to seek over $165 million for projects? The same projects, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister said that he's already sourced money for. And if the member from Ancillary 1, Mr. Speaker, if he doesn't know what letter I'm speaking about, I can make the letter that's circulating a document at the House. Would you allow me, Mr. Speaker?
Make it a document.
Because you apparently doesn't know which letter. I have copies of it. I can make it a document at the House, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we'll make it a document at the House, Mr. Speaker. Because he doesn't know which letter I'm talking about, Mr. Speaker. No, I don't have time to read it, Mr. Speaker. So, no, I don't have time to read it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, will he ask for an investigation? Now, Mr. Speaker, let me tell you why this is a serious matter, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell you why this is a serious letter, serious matter, Mr. Speaker. Why is it serious? No, you don't have to make a document at the House, Prime Minister, but if you allow it. Here it is, Mr. Speaker. Here it is, Mr. Speaker. This is a serious matter. Here it is, Honorable Member. Here it is. A letter is prepared on the official government letterhead. The official government letterhead, Mr. Speaker, asking a company to raise over $162 million, Mr. Speaker. And it is signed by a minister. Now, I am not saying whether he signed it or not. There are two issues, Mr. Speaker. If the minister, in fact, issues the letter, Mr. Speaker, there should be an investigation into
Speaker,
how somebody...
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker. I really want to find out, is that letter a document of the House? Is it accepted? He said a letter.
No, that's it wrong.
The honourable member indicated he could circulate the document. He circulated his document.
No, Mr. Speaker.
So they circulated the wrong one. Yeah.
Without the permission of the Speaker, you can just circulate the document? And quote that document, Mr. Speaker?
No, he has not quoted any document.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want you to my time to run out.
He has not
on
quoted
you,
any document.
So let me...
But he said he has a document he wished to circulate to members. That's his prerogative.
Let me continue, because I will not be distracted, Mr. Speaker. So I was saying to you, a letter is written on the government letterhead.
How do you know that?
On the government letterhead. The letter that's in circulation. Now here there are two issues with it, Mr. Speaker. Either it's a fake or it is valid. If it is a fake, we have to investigate who are the people out there forging letters on official government letterhead and forging the signature of the minister. So if it is fake, we must call in Interpol to find out how there are letters like that circulating all over the world, in many institutions around the world. Somebody is forging letters on the official letterhead and forging the signature of the minister. We must investigate it. And the Prime Minister must call in international law enforcement to find out who are the people doing that. That's if it's a fake. But if it is real, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister must understand the circumstances under which a minister in his government is issuing such letters when he's not the Minister of Finance. It has not been approved by Cabinet, and he has no authority to do so. So if it's a fake, it's a national security issue. And if it is valid, it's a serious issue of misconduct by a minister. That same minister who was mentioned in the Ascenza papers, and he's asking for the Robert Lindquist report. They spent $3 million. Give me a copy. Mr. Speaker, go and ask the U.S. authorities for the Lindquist report. Go and ask them. Because they are the ones doing the investigation, Mr. Speaker. Go and ask them.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr.
again,
Speaker,
I have to rise on a point of order. The member from Castries South continues to suggest that the investigation in the U.S. was initiated by the U.S.
I never said so.
That's what he just said. All the documents show that the investigation was initiated by the Attorney General's office, and all the reports and making the said person a person of interest was done by the Attorney General here in St. Lucia. All that was requested from the U.S. was a copy of the telephone numbers of an individual. There is no investigation by the U.S. into any member in this House that I know of.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let's move on, Mr. Speaker. Withdraw which statement? Let me repeat what I said, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me repeat what I said. I said the member from Castries office has asked for a copy of the Robert Lindquist report. I told him to go and ask the U.S. authorities. Because all the documents the Prime Minister spoke about, the U.S. authorities have it, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, again on a point of order. Member from Castries South again is misleading the House. The investigation by Robert Lindquist was as a conclusion of a cabinet conclusion in which the government of St. Lucia paid the money, and the report was initiated by the government of St. Lucia and had absolutely nothing to do with the U.S. authorities. The only person who participated from the U.S. was Mr. Lindquist himself, who's an American. But there is no participation by the U.S. government in any investigation, and why would he be even suggesting that we go and make a request of the government of the United States of America, when in fact that he's the one and his party who should be giving us the report.
Can I continue, Mr. Speaker? I will move on from that point. The Prime Minister may be right. So, okay. So, Mr. Prime Minister, Okay, so you've said whatever you said about the report. Mr. Speaker, ask the Prime Minister to give us a few reports now. Where is the report on the investigation into that same Ascenza papers? Release the report to the House. You told us you would. Where is the report, Mr. Speaker, on the St. Jude Hospital reconstruction technical audit, Mr. Speaker? Where is the report, Mr. Speaker, on the St. Jude reconstruction financial report, Mr. Where is it? Where is the DSH agreement the PM promised to make a public document? Where is the joint statement from Range, Mr. Speaker? Where is the list of projects and programs that you are claiming were financed under the CIP, Mr. Speaker? So, Mr. Speaker, if you want reports, there are reports the Prime Minister should first present to this House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, is encouraging the creation of a class of persons who act with impunity, with no regard for procedures and the public good, Mr. Speaker. By his own actions, not to discipline his deviant ministers, Mr. Speaker, he's encouraging that culture, Mr. Speaker. The member from Castries office, Mr. Speaker, looked straight at the camera, Mr. Speaker, during the estimate debates and said, I believe in good governance. I always follow the right procedures. He looked at the camera with sincerity as much as he could portray and said that to the people of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. But he's right for saying it because the Prime Minister allows him to do it, Mr. Speaker. And I had a member from Castries office last night. It is a challenge to be honest in this country. I know it. I go through it every day. Mr. Speaker, do you know what that means? A member is saying that it is a challenge to be honest in St. Lucia. He knows it. He goes through it every day. Mr. Speaker, I don't find it a challenge to be honest in St. Lucia. I don't, Mr. Speaker. When you listen to those things, Mr. Speaker, you understand where the growth is going. All the growth, that's where it's going. Where is the accountability, Mr. Speaker? And when we talk about transparency, here where the growth is going. Was there any tendering for the Ernst & Young consultancy of over $7 million? No tendering. The Roseau Valley Vanna Road, was it put to tender? No tendering. The Blanchard Road, no tendering. The Roseau Dam site, Mr. Speaker. The airport redevelopment project, no tendering. Mr. Speaker, no tendering, no tendering. Pimando, no tendering. Packer Company, no tendering. And we heard yesterday the contract has an additional $2.1 million US to it, Mr. Speaker. No tendering. I heard it. I listened to everything. I heard it, Mr. Speaker. No. Hear what I'm saying. Hear what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker. No. Honorable member. Hear what I'm saying. We heard yesterday that the project now has an additional $2.1 million US in it. Well, you heard contract, but anyway. If I said contract, I meant okay. If I said contract, project. But the person administering the project has a contract. So, Mr. Speaker, I write my own speeches, and I've written for other
Honorable
people.
member,
You can't write a speech for yourself.
Honorable
Mr.
member.
Speaker,
Honorable
when we fought.
Honorable member. Through here, please.
Mr. Speaker, always through you. Always through you. But, Mr. Speaker, you must accept that he gets a little carried away sometimes. Mr. Speaker, just when we thought the no tendering would end, because the public outrage was so great, Mr. Speaker, we would hear that there is now a new direct award to Fresh Start again for the Castries market. When will it end, Mr. Speaker? When will it end? When, Mr. Speaker? When will the no tendering end? When will growth in this country filter down to the average St. Lucian, Mr. Speaker? So, Mr. Speaker, when you speak of better managers and better execution, Mr. Speaker, you are executing the people of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. And they are feeling it, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, you understand why members at the side try so hard to make the member from Castries office, Honorable Guy Joseph, look like a saint, Mr. Speaker. They try to make him look like a saint, Mr. Speaker, because the people of St. Lucia are disillusioned. They are regretful, and they are disheartened by the performance of this government. Even when they have growth, even when debt to GDP declines, Mr. Speaker, because the growth is only growing for a selected few friends, family, and undeserving foreigners, Mr. Speaker. They mentioned people budget over 1,000 times over the last 2 days, Mr. Speaker, because they want to convince St. Lucians now that we are for you, we are all in. But St. Lucians are not that stupid, Mr. Speaker. They're not, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we truly need a government that's for the people. We need an economy of the people and for the people. We need a society of the people and for the people. It's not just doing projects and doing projects, Mr. Speaker. You see, Mr. Speaker, the government side cannot understand that. Let me give you an example. My dear friend, the member from Strozel Saltibus, Mr. Speaker. We go back a very long way, Mr. Speaker. And he had promised this house that he would never become a politician. But last week he came with the brightest yellow tie. And I said, Mr. Speaker, Monsieur Bradley, fini. That tie was too bright, Mr. Speaker. But listen to him, Mr. Speaker. He was talking about Ojo Labs. And he was boasting of how many hundreds of people are working there. And that it is a success story. Mr. Speaker, we are not against the setting up of call centers. We're not against setting up investment, Mr. Speaker. Our problem with Ojo Labs, Mr. Speaker, is that a foreign investor, someone who's supposed to bring in the money to invest in setting up the call center, instead is asking our government to provide the money. And we believe, Mr. Speaker, that if the government is going to take $10 million, give it to a group of solutions. Give it to a solution. We support, Mr. Speaker, if Ojo Labs had come in here with $10 million and said, I'm bringing $10 million, I'm setting up this AI lab, I would be the biggest champion, Mr. Speaker. My difficulty, and the member from Strozel Saltibus cannot get it, Mr. Speaker. It is not against the investment. It's against the fact that $10 million or whatever amount, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister can correct me, is being given to a foreign investor who's supposed to bring in the money. That's the fundamental problem.
Mr. Speaker, would you allow me a point of clarification?
Once I'm not losing my time, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Speaker, just on a point of clarification, which I indicated last week in my presentation, I did indicate that $5 million went towards the retrofitting of a factory shell, which belongs to St. Lucia, and the rest of the money, Mr. Speaker, is being paid to St. Lucians, Mr. Speaker, for their salaries. To St. Lucians. So there's been no money given to an investor. I just wanted to clarify that, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, that's the point, Mr. Speaker. That's the point. If the government of St. Lucia money is being spent, let it spend for an enterprise that is owned and run by St. Lucians. And the member from Strozel Saltibus was comparing it with an earlier practice where we were paying salaries for St. Lucian business persons. That's what we support. Take the money and pay it for St. Lucian business persons, not paying the salaries in an enterprise that is owned by a foreigner. And the member from Strozel Saltibus, even standing now, shows you how he is missing the essence of the argument. That the ideological divide between us have grown so wide, comrade. You understand? You can't even understand anymore, Mr. Speaker. Even if your best intent will have become well, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yeah, we'll talk about that tomorrow, Good Friday. Mr. Speaker, I must go back to the comments made by the leader of the opposition when he spoke. When he spoke about a new vision, a new way forward, Mr. Speaker. How much more time do I have, Mr. Speaker?
17 minutes.
Okay, Mr. Speaker.
5 more minutes.
Mr. Speaker, in summary, Mr. Speaker, this budget, a lot of glitz, a lot of show, no substance, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes, Mr. Speaker, you want to listen to a presentation and you may not agree with it, but you can feel that it has a direction, it has a purpose, and I may not agree with it, but I can feel that it is holistic and is going somewhere. I may not agree with the journey, because I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, all of us in here want to go to the same destination. Huh? At least most of us in here. A better St. Lucia, better quality of life. The journey, we might disagree on it. But in this budget, you don't feel, Mr. Speaker, that there is a clear pathway that is being followed. You know what it reminds, you know what it tells me, Mr. Speaker? It's like the Prime Minister has about 10 advisors out there. And all of them are giving him ideas, Mr. Speaker. And from each one, he's taking the brightest idea and he's putting it together and saying that's the budget. There's no coherence, there's no integration, there's no clear pathway that somebody listens to this budget and they can hear. There's none, Mr. Speaker. It's almost like if you take a newspaper and you cut it up in 10 pieces, you take 10 newspapers and you cut it and you just stick them together. They don't read right. They don't read right. This budget doesn't read right, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I listened to the member from Soufrière. And I must tell him, Mr. Speaker, he's a friend of mine, that I suspect yesterday he was on rehearsal to get a promotion to be a full minister. And let me tell you, Prime Minister, you did well. You did very well yesterday. You deserve to be made a full minister. You deserve to be a full minister. If yesterday was your rehearsal to be promoted, you passed the test. And I will recommend to the Prime Minister they make you a full minister, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, even listening to him, Mr. Speaker, you couldn't get a sense that he was struggling, Mr. Speaker, to find a way through this budget, and he resorted to what he did yesterday, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, we want St. Lucians want to know that when there is growth, the people benefit from growth. When there is improvement in fiscal management, the people benefit from it, Mr. Speaker. Deep down as St. Lucians, we want to be prosperous in this country. We want to enjoy the prosperity of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. And everything I have said, from all the contracts that did not go to tender, from all that I've said about accountability, for all that I've said about the new tax income, Mr. Speaker, there's not a sense that our St. Lucia belongs to us and that we are the ones really benefiting from it, Mr. Speaker. That is, for us, the greatest fear, Mr. Speaker. We may not always do everything right, Mr. Speaker, but there's one principle that will always guide us, Mr. Speaker, and it's why I'm part of this Labour Party. St. Lucia's prosperity must primarily be enjoyed by St. Lucians, Mr. Speaker. And it hurts me, Mr. Speaker, when I hear some of the decisions of this government. Mr. Speaker, I love some of the sports ideas, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister and I have had exchanges as to whether or not the approach is the best, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, everything that has been done under this Packer company, a company, Mr. Speaker, that is registered and promoted as a hospitality equipment provider, is doing our sporting facilities. We have enough talent in St. Lucia. 3 of the cricket grounds in this region were designed by St. Lucians. All the pitches have been prepared, all the outfit been prepared by a St. Lucian for cricket. But then, Mr. Speaker, we follow somebody who tells us we should put artificial turf around this country in a project costing over $42 million. That, Mr. Speaker, speaks of why, Mr. Speaker, I cannot approve this budget, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, St. Jude's, OKEU, the member from Castries North will tell you, the hospital was started by the Labour Party. The member continued it. They downsized it, Mr. Speaker. We did not finish it in the 5 years, Mr. Speaker. This government came back and said, we'll finish it immediately, Mr. Speaker. It's 3 years, it's gotten worse. And you hear on one hand, we're speaking to Colombians, next hand, we're speaking to Cayman Island, we're doing this, we're doing that. Meanwhile, people are suffering, Mr. Speaker. The people elected a new government to solve the problems, Mr. Speaker. They elected a government on the promise, Mr. Speaker, that they would remove VAT, Mr. Speaker, immediate reduction and eventual removal, Mr. Speaker, after 3 years, Mr. Speaker. That's why you elect governments, to correct the wrongs. But all they do, Mr. Speaker, is fight with Labour Party. We're better than y'all. Y'all did this. Mr. Speaker, I was never a minister. Never. I cannot tell you what was done, what was not done. I hear stories. But, Mr. Speaker, all of that aside, the people of St. Lucia want St. Lucia to improve. And they are not feeling it, Mr. Speaker. That is the problem in this budget. It's a very strong attempt to convince the people of St. Lucia that this is a people's budget. But the people know that this budget is not for them, it's not about them, Mr. Speaker. It is using them, Mr. Speaker. It's using them for the friends, the families, and the undeserving foreigners, Mr. Speaker. And if you wanted a better example of it, Mr. Speaker, look at the WePay scandal, Mr. Speaker. Look at the WePay scandal, Mr. Speaker. But that's for another day, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I cannot in good conscience represent the people of Castries South and support this appropriations bill. Thank you very much.